Hi, and welcome to It's Not Obvious, Java Edition, and today I will be talking about user input. Specifically, today I will be talking about scanner objects, declaring and using scanner objects, and really briefly I will be talking about what the official documentation is for scanner, import statements, and this concept of an object. But I will be focusing primarily on getting, storing, and using user input, specifically a whole bunch of different types. And towards the end, I will be going over briefly if statements so that we can check for user input. I highly recommend before you begin this episode that you watch my previous video on variables, because if you don't, this episode is going to be pretty difficult to follow. That said, this video is primarily intended for my CSS 142 students at the University of Washington. Although if you are new to Java programming and you're interested in how to do Java programming, this episode might also be beneficial for you. All right, so who am I? If it matters, I am currently a part-time faculty at the University of Washington. I'm also, during the day, a software manager at Amazon, specifically in AWS Kumo. I'm Hansel, and if you want to find out more about what I've done and what I'm doing, definitely find me on LinkedIn and let's connect over there. Okay, one of the first questions before I begin is this programming? And the short answer is yes, kind of. If we think about the PET model though, what I've introduced previously, which is problem solving, engineering, tools, and terminology, this is really only the very beginning of the very basic tools. Specifically, we're gonna go over some terminology, we're gonna go over tools that you need to know in order to do programming, specifically how to interact with the user and get user input. Okay. So, before we begin, if we're talking about Java and if we're talking about getting user input in Java, one of the first things that you're going to be doing is to look at the scanner object and use the scanner object. Right. So, if you were to go to the link that I provided, you would see this documentation from Oracle. Now, Oracle are the people who created the Java language. They're the people who created the scanner object. So, if you want to get as authoritative a source as possible, this is it. Now, if you were to read what a scanner object is in this page, it says a scanner object is a simple text scanner which can parse primitive types and strings using regular expressions. At this point, that probably doesn't mean much to you. So what I highly recommend is to think of a scanner object as an object in real life. Specifically, think about barcode scanners like in a grocery store where you can scan something and it recognizes the object. It kind of carries a similar idea. In order to properly use the scanner object, you need to have this import statement, import Java util scanner, and you need this before the class definition. In a moment, I'm going to demonstrate what happens if you don't do that. You are also going to need to get a new instance of a scanner object, let's say something like this, scanner user input new scanner system in. Now keep in mind that this is actually a variable. Specifically, scanner is a non-primitive variable type, which is a little bit different than stuff that you've done before, because before you were working with primitive variable types, and now scanner is a non-primitive variable type. Okay, let's not worry too much just yet in terms of what that really means. You're going to work with both primitive as well as non-primitives as you go on, as you do more programming in Java. Okay, so as far as this scanner instance, what this variable is, you really only need one for a particular scope. For now, especially for this episode, we're really only going to work with one scope, so don't worry about it too much. You only need to declare it once. Okay, and at some point, you are going to need to get the user input by giving the variable name for the scanner instance and using one of the methods available to it, such as nextInt to get an integer, and then storing it inside of an integer variable. Now, the documentation actually do mention all of this too, where it says, hey, okay, this code allows a user to read a number from system in, scanner sc equals new scanner system in, I equals sc.nextInt. Now, you might notice that I have a slightly different code than the demonstration over here. It's a scanner sc, I have scanner user input, but after that it's the same, new scanner system in, new scanner system in. Keep in mind that sc and user input are really just variable names, and it can be anything you want. It's completely arbitrary, and in fact I'm going to use a completely different one again when I go to the demonstration in just a moment. Okay, now as far as methods, think of methods as really a bunch of code that can be executed with a single call. That's the whole purpose of a method, is so that you can aggregate a whole bunch of actions, a whole bunch of statements, so that all of the statements can be executed with a single call. You call a method by giving it the method name and the open close parentheses. If you give it the wrong method name, or if you don't have the correct capitalization, or if you don't have the open close parentheses, it's not gonna work. And in fact, for scatter instances, you are gonna have to use the variable name of the scatter instance dot the method name open close parentheses in order for it to work, which again, I will demonstrate in a moment. So these are the methods that I'm going to care about, that I'm going to demonstrate for this particular episode. Next, which is something that allows you to get a string up to the first empty space. Next line, which allows you to get an entire line up to the first new line. Next int, which allows you to get an integer. Next double, which allows you to get a double. And next boolean, which, as the name implies, gets you a boolean. There are actually a whole bunch of other methods. And in fact, if we were to go into the method summary, scroll down, we have a whole bunch of methods that are available here and some demonstration or some explanation as to what it is. So say, for example, here, next, it says return the next token if it matches the specified pattern. What is a token? Or here, scans the next token of the input into a Boolean value and returns that value. Again, this documentation tends to be extremely technical, and it requires you to properly understand what it means before you can properly understand all of this documentation. If at this point in time you don't quite understand everything that this documentation says, don't worry about it. That's why I provided essentially a cheat sheet that allows you to understand what all of this means. Now, there's also additional methods that starts with has next, etc., etc. method. And if we were to look over here, let's say if we were to say has next double, returns true if the next token in the scanner input can be interpreted as a double value using the next double method. Basically, it allows you to check if the user is giving something that can be used with the next double method. Essentially, that's what it is. Now, I highly recommend that you experiment with it. That said, for this particular episode, I will not be going over the has next methods. Okay, so before we go any further, why don't I demonstrate what these methods look like, how to use these methods. And of course, we begin by using BlueJ. You're welcome to use any IDE that you want. And as always, we start with some new project name, and the project name can be anything you want, and spaces and capitalization can also be included. It doesn't matter too much. Okay, so let's say user input project. Okay, we say okay. And then we also still have to create a new class. We can give the class name anything you want. That said, the class name cannot contain any spaces in it. So let's say example. And as always, BlueJ starts us off with a whole bunch of code that we don't need just yet. So we're going to get rid of everything other than the class name, because that is necessary. That is a requirement of Java. And we start, as always, with public static void main string array args. Okay, great. And just to make sure that this works the way we expect it to, let's start with the basic hello world. System out println hello world. Let's compile this. Let's run this. And we get hello world. I'll just make sure real quick that under options, I have clear screen at method call, which allows me to start with a clean slate every single time I run the code, which is great. Okay, so let's start by creating a scanner instance. Earlier, the demonstration is we need to do scanner and some sort of variable name, and keep in mind again that it can be anything you want. So let's say scanner input equals new scanner system in. And immediately the computer, in this case BlueJ, complains and it says cannot find symbol class scanner. So it knows and it recognizes that scanner is probably intended to be a class. It's probably intended to be this object. But it's saying that, hey, I don't know what scanner is. I cannot find this symbol at all. Which means that we need to do import java util scanner. And keep in mind that capitalization matters, spelling does matter. And now we have scanner input new scanner. We can compile this and we can run it. It worked, but it does absolutely nothing just yet other than, hello world. Okay, why? Because we're not asking the user for any input just yet. All right, so let's ask the user, system out println, what is your name? We can compile this, we can run this, and now it says, hello world, what is your name? But there is absolutely no way to enter a name or any string at all. Why? Because we're not actually using the scanner instance just yet. We have declared an instance of the scanner object, but we're not using it to call any method that gets a user input. So we need to very specifically say input, let's say next, because we want to get a string. We want to get the person's name, which is probably a string. We can compile this. We can run this, which is great. And let's say, hello world, what is your name? Now I can actually enter my name, Hansel, and it goes Hansel. Awesome. Now let's say that we want to use, let's say we want to do something with that user input. Let's say by saying welcome to the user. System out println, welcome. But how do we include the username in here? Now you might think that you might be able to just copy and paste this input.next inside of welcome, but it's probably not going to work too well. Instead, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to put whatever the user gives you inside of a variable. Let's say string name, and then we can say name equals whatever the user puts in using input.next. So then now we can say welcome plus name. Okay, compile, run, what is your name? Hansel, and now it says welcome exclamation Hansel, which is not great because we don't have any spaces. And in fact, if we really want to fix this, we'll do welcome, comma, space, plus name, plus exclamation. Now if we compile this, and we run this, and now we have hello world, what is your name? And I'll do Hansel, and it says welcome Hansel in this neatly formatted thing. Okay, so you can see that by calling this next method for input, it allows us to get some sort of a string, and that string needs to be stored in some sort of variable, because that's the purpose of a variable, which is to store some kind of value, and in this case it stores a string. Okay, then we also have this expression welcome plus name exclamation. Now previously, one of the things that I did during the demonstration for variables is to go through an explanation as to what's happening in the background. So I'm going to do that here too. Let's say we have scanner as the variable type, and the variable name at this point is just input, and the variable value, we don't know what it is. In fact, this is what's called an instance of scanner, which, because it's an instance of scanner, it's really a memory location for a scanner instance. We're not going to get into memory locations just yet, but memory location is an extremely important concept that you're going to need to know sooner rather than later. Okay, and then we also have string, variable name, name, and the variable value is whatever the user gives you. At the beginning, it's just an empty string, but the moment the user gives some sort of a string, in this case I gave it Hansel, then the value in here is Hansel. And the expression is welcome, comma, plus name, plus exclamation. And so the values retrieved is it gets the name variable, and it gets the value instead of that variable, and it becomes welcome, comma, space, plus Hansel, plus exclamation, which means the process value is what we saw it, welcome Hansel. Okay, great. So let's experiment a little bit more with other types of input. So let's say if we were to go system out println, what is your age? And then we can do input.next int, and let's say just whole numbers. And as before, we can run this, we can compile it, and we get what is your name? Hansel. And what is your age? Let's say 7. I'm definitely a lot older than 7, but for the purposes of demonstration, that was the first thing that comes to mind. And as before, we saw that absolutely nothing is happening when it comes to age at all. Okay? Which means that we need to do something in order to store that input. This is intended to be an integer, so let's give it int age, and then here we do age equals input.nextInt. Okay, so now we have a way to get a string and we have a way to get an integer, and now we can update this and say welcome plus name, and let's say plus age plus, and now this is age plus exclamation. All right, so now if we compile, we run this, and we say Hansel Ong, and now we get an error because first we have name, and then we get age. It's saying that there's an error when it comes to age. What is going on? And the main reason why this is happening is because I included a space here between Hansel and Ong. And so what's really going on is that the computer is taking the first string, Hansel, and trying to put it into name, which it did, and then it tries to get this second string, Ong, and putting it into age. So let's demonstrate what happens there. Okay, so Hansel, and let's say 7. And all of a sudden, it skips the whole question of what is your age 7, and instead it just do welcome Hansel age 7. Okay, so there's something that's going on there. Remember that earlier I mentioned when it comes to next, it gets a string up to the first empty space. After that, the scanner instance actually stops looking at the user input until the next scanner method is called, and then it gets the next thing. So that's really what's happening here. Okay, let's see if we can understand this a little bit better and debug it essentially to understand properly what's going on. For now, I am just going to comment out all of these things. And remember that this is our way of having multi-line comments by having this /* and then ending it with */. And right now we don't have age at all. So why don't I copy and paste this, and then we'll comment out what it was previously, and we'll just get rid of this H segment for here, making sure that we still have the exclamation. Okay, so now if we run it, we only have the what is your name Hansel. And in fact, we can do the same thing again. What is your name? If I were to do Hansel Ong, it still just says Hansel because it goes all the way to the space and then it stops. And whatever is remaining is then received by the next method that's called with the scanner instance. Okay, how do we fix this? If we want to get the entire line, instead of input.next, we do input.nextLine. Compile, run it. What is your name? Hansel Ong. And now it says welcome Hansel Ong. And that's what the difference is between next and next line. Next gets a string all the way up to the first empty space, and next line gets an entire line up to the first new line. Okay, great. So let's enable things like we had before and make sure that it works properly. Okay, so we compile this, and then we run this, and let's say I'll do a Hansel Ong, age, let's say 9, just got a little bit older, and now it says welcome Hansel Ong, age 9. Cool. Now, I've shown you how you can basically craft a message given the user input. Before we go any further, why don't we explore a few other methods that we're going to that's going to be available to you. Okay. Now, in terms of methods, we have nextInt, which if we've already experimented, we need to also do next double and next boolean. Right. Let's do that. system out print line how much money you have right now, including cents. And then we do double money, and then money equals input dot next double. And let's say system out print line, are you human? True, false. And let's say boolean is human, and then is human equals input dot next boolean. Open close parentheses, semicolon, compile. Now, if you happen to forget the open close parentheses, immediately it's going to complain. It's going to say cannot find symbol variable next boolean. Because if you don't have the open close parentheses, it thinks that this is a variable as opposed to a method. Okay. Now that's going to be a very significant distinction because very quickly, very soon, you are going to have to learn how to use methods properly. All right. Now at this point, I'm going to just run it. And then you go, what is your name? Hansel Ong, and age, again, let's say 12, getting older every single minute. How much money do I have right now, including cents? Let's say that in terms of cash, I don't have that much cash because everything's just digital nowadays. Let's say $78 and then 87 cents. Cool, are you human? I'm going to pretend that I am human. Well, I am human, or at least I think I am. But I've also been watching Westworld lately, so I don't know what you think about that. All right, so true. Now, Hansel, you might be thinking, Hansel, you completely forgot to use these variables, these values. There's nothing in here that uses money, that uses is human. Okay, well, let's use that. Let's modify this message to include those new variables. Okay, welcome, name, age, blah, plus with money, $, plus money, plus, and let's say is human. And I'm going to stretch this out a little bit longer so it's easier to see. Plus is human plus is human plus exclamation. Okay, let's compile this again. Let's run this. Okay, what is your name? Hansel. Let's say 11, just got younger there. And let's do 89.34 this time. Got a little bit more money even though I got younger. And let's say this time I say false. Welcome Hansel, age 11 with money, 89.34 is human, false. Ooh, okay. I think the computer's onto me. But anyway, so now you have the idea that you can store all sorts of values into variables and then you can use those values somehow in an expression. Okay, so let's talk about expressions next. Now, programs, as we know it, are really only as useful as we make it to be. And the question is, what do you want the program to do for the user? Now that you have a way to get input from the user, what do you want your program to do given the user input? In this case, the first thing that I've demonstrated is to return or draft the message. Let me demonstrate how you can do mathematical calculations next. Okay, now I'm just gonna get rid of everything other than the scanner instance. And I'm gonna ask the user for two numbers. System out print line, give me a number between 1 and 10. And I need the closing parentheses because otherwise it complains. And let's do int num1 equals input dot next int. And then let's do system out print line, give me another number between 1 and 10. And let's say int num2 equals input dot next int. Okay, great. And now let's do system out print line. I didn't forget this time. I actually remembered to actually do the multiplication. The two numbers multiplied is, and let's say num1 times num2. Okay, great. Now we have a way to get the user input to get a number and then a second number. We store them inside variables, and then we do some sort of an expression that calculates the product of it, and we compile it. We run this, and let's say we do 7 and we do 3. The two numbers multiplied is 21. Okay, great. Let's also look at what that means. We still have the scanner input variable. We don't have the name variable anymore. This expression also doesn't matter anymore. Instead, we have int num1, int num2, and initially, the default value for integer variables in Java is typically 0. But then the user, in this case myself, I put in the first number as 7, the second number as 3, and the expression is num1 times num2, which means 7 times 3, and the process value is 21. Except that it goes beyond that, right? Because now we also have this bigger expression. The two numbers multiplied is blah. Okay, so this is the broader expression, and which means that we get the two number multiplied is plus 21, which is why we get the two numbers multiplied is 21. Okay? Cool. All right, so let's understand this a little bit better. What if we were to give a number beyond 10 or less than 1? If we were to run this and we give it, let's say the number 12 and let's say the number -3, it still calculates the numbers correctly. And in this case, because it's still just numbers, it's still just integers, it doesn't really cause any problems other than it violates the rule that it's between 1 and 10. What if we were to go a different way? What if we were to give, instead of a number, we give it ONE, which is just the word 1, and immediately we get an error that says Java utilities input mismatch exception, and we're expecting to get a number, an integer, but instead we get a string, which is why it's complaining at us. But the error message really doesn't say much to us. It just says input mismatch exception. Okay, so for now, assume that if you're asking the user for a number, the user properly will give you a number. If you really want to do that kind of a check, you really should be using the hasNext int or hasNext double type of methods. But that's beyond the scope of this particular episode. Maybe in the future I'll go over it. Not something that I test on or expect my students to know just yet. But if you're writing your own program, you might want to explore that. Okay, cool. So let's understand this a little bit more. We've done returning or drafting a message. We've done mathematical calculations. There is also responding to user's choice, which is not going to be able to do much just yet because you haven't learned how to respond to users' choices, getting multiple choices and responding to it, and so on. So the next part is really to explore what it means to respond to users' choices using if statements. And there's really a whole bunch of other stuff that you can do with user input, but we're not going to worry about that just yet. These are just the very beginnings of working with user input. Keep in mind that the user input is really only a value. It's intended to be stored in a variable, and you're expected to use this just like any other value in variables. And keep in mind that how it works in the background is there's variable type, variable name, variable value, and that's used instead of expressions and the values that you retrieve, that gets retrieved by the computer and the process value. All right, so let's make sure that we can check the user input. Remember again that variable names are arbitrary and doesn't mean anything to the computer. And just because you ask the user for something that you give them some specific instructions doesn't mean the user is going to follow those instructions. You do need to check the user input to make sure that it is what you expect it to be. Okay? So here we are asking the user to give us a number between 1 and 10. And we're asking the user to give us another number between 1 and 10. And there's absolutely nothing that prevents the user from giving a number beyond 1 and 10. And again, as part of the demonstration, let's say if we were to do 90 and we were to go -5, the math is correct, but the numbers, the user input is wrong. All right, so let's understand user input. If num1 is greater than 10 or num1 is less than 1, system out print line, you didn't give us a correct number. Do you know how to follow instructions? We'll be a little bit sassy here, I guess, the computer. Same thing over here. Instead of num1 though, we're gonna have num2. And you didn't give us a correct number. Do you know how to follow instructions? And again, we can compile this and we can run this. And let's say if we were to give it 90, you didn't give us a correct number. Do you know how to follow instructions? And let's say if we were to do -5, again, we give that message again, but we still do the math regardless. Okay, what if the user gives the correct number the first time around? Cool, no message is displayed. And let's say that the user gives a bad number the second time around and we do give the message, right? So same thing if we were to flip it. Let's say the user gives it some big number and the user goes, oh yeah, I'm supposed to follow instructions. It's supposed to be between 1 and 10. Cool. Then they put in 4. All right, we don't give the error message the second time around. That still doesn't change the fact that the user was successfully able to put in those numbers and there was nothing that asked the user to repeat the process again to give a correct number. This is only checking user input. Repeating the process and asking the user to give a correct value is yet another method, is yet another process that you're gonna have to learn, and probably you're gonna have to learn using loops in order to do that. Okay, but that's for another day. That's really it for today. That's really it for working with user input, the very basics of it, working with scanner objects. And the idea is I want to ask you, as always, were there things that were obvious to you? And did you learn anything new? If there were things in this episode that were not obvious to you, please do tell me in the comments and I'll do what I can to address it. If you like this episode, definitely subscribe for more content because I'm going to be doing a lot more of these videos and also other more fun videos that are not just about programming. Right? Thank you and see you next time.